afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. At IGD, we are here to support your lifelong learning journey, and this means we provide free, relevant online learning and events for you and your teams. We focus on the topics that are critical to you, and this includes topics such as managing teams and leadership. And so today, I'm delighted to welcome Anne Frank, the Chief Executive of the CMI, to share her own perspective on how leadership and management skills are evolving in this current climate. Anne knows our industry well, having worked for P&G and Mars, so it's great to have you as part of this conversation, Anne. And I know you're going to spend the next 30 minutes sharing your perspective, and then we'll have a 10-15 minute question and answer session at the end of your presentation. So for the audience, if you have any questions, please do type those in the control panel that you can see in front of you. And before we start, we'd like to ask you a couple of questions to understand a bit more about who you are and how you're currently working. So if we launch that survey now, and if you can share with us your feedback. So the first question is, how are you and your teams currently working? Are you 100% working from home, a blend of home and workplace working, or are you 100% workplace working? Fantastic, I can see the results coming in. And what we can see is we have got the vast majority of people are working from home. Second, we have about 26% working blendedly from home and the workplace, and some are working totally in the workplace. So it's good to have a good mix of you here. And then the second question is your business currently experiencing greater or less or about the same demand? Great, I can see those answers coming in, thank you. I'll just give it a few more seconds just so that we get a true read. Fantastic, thank you. So what we can see is we've got 66% experiencing greater demand, 11% experiencing less demand, and about 23% experiencing the same. So that's really useful to give us that perspective. And I know, Anne, that will help inform some of the research that you've been doing as well. So with that in mind, Anne, I'll hand over to you to share your perspective on line management and leadership skills. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. In addition to my own background at Mars and P&G, last night I welcomed CMI's new president, and he is Mark Price, Lord Mark Price now. And I know many of you will know him well, as he was for many years the MD of Waitrose. So great to be here. I'm going to talk about management skills that matter now and in the future, and touch on some of the pre and post-COVID trends in your industry and more generally. So if I could have the next slide, please. So pre-COVID, we were already doing some work on what are the management trends, and a lot of you will just recognize these. We have pre-COVID been experiencing a rise in flexible working. Obviously, that's something that a lot of people advocating for gender and for disability have lobbied for many years, but it has obviously been dramatically accelerated, and we'll come on to what that means. But it has been rising steadily over the past 5 years. Of course, we've also seen the rise of more technology. And of course, people were talking a lot about AI and robots threatening the roles and jobs of people. Others, the ONS and McKinsey have all predicted a lot of people being displaced by that. But of course, the technology is also speeded up, and we'll come back to talk about that. Now, this is also a trend that was pre-COVID. There have been changing expectations of both employees and consumers. So much greater demand on the part of consumers for businesses to consider their wider impact on society, their purpose, if you like, and also employees very concerned about especially younger employees working for organizations that do have purpose at their heart, And obviously that changes corporate governance arrangements, a greater emphasis on so-called ESG, environmental, social, and governance impact. And last but not least, new flexible business models, the gig economy, whether that is Uber or Deliveroo. So these were all trends pre-COVID, but if I could have the next slide, please. So what about your industry, and especially since COVID? Well, obviously, and you confirmed this, many of you, so 2/3 of you, are experiencing greater demand. And that has meant that you've had to meet that at unprecedented speed. And obviously that also means that you've had to dramatically simplify your ranges. I was talking to one of our companions, Fiona Dawson, the president of Mars Food, and she was saying, the 10 power SKUs and that's it. That's what we're making. And that's been true for many of you, I know. You're also managing mixed workforces. And it was interesting to see, and again, we'll come on and compare with our data, but a lot of you are working remotely. And that's new for many of you. And many of you are also working in a blended sense where you're actually having to manage mixed teams, some in the workplace, some not. This does present different challenges. Clearly, health and safety in terms of the physical risk, social distancing, providing PPE, slowing factory lines for those working on site, for those working remotely. The huge challenge that's happened over the summer of balancing childcare and work, and also balancing how work schedules coalesce with home schedules. That's been a huge challenge. Common to both has been the rise of the challenge of mental health. So that's, no matter where you're working, the focus on mental health has dramatically increased. Now, obviously, those are very human issues, but there's also been the huge issue in your industry of how you manage your supply chains. And that's in two different dimensions. Obviously, maybe three if you add the simplification I talked about. The first is that you are in global businesses, many of you, and of course, although this is a global pandemic, the rules vary, the regs vary, how governments approach things vary, and coming up with, you know, sort of minimum acceptable standards and global consistency for your employees around the world in your factories and stores has been a major concern. And that's meant clear expectations have been incredibly important. But the other factor that's come in is resilience. Because of just in time, many of you have been caught because you didn't have any buffer stocks. And so now there's a reevaluation of how do you manage the need for greater resilience in supply chains. And so many challenges that are perhaps unique to your industry. If I could have the next slide, please. But there's also opportunities. It's a proven fact that crises do drive innovation. And I know there's been no shortage of that in your industry. You've had opportunities to create different kinds of products or a chance to change focus. Moving to healthier food and drink, online shopping, home delivery, and frozen food as people visit stores less frequently. There have been new marketing opportunities. Again, how can you be more helpful to your consumers and your customers? And how can you be more lighthearted as well to provide perhaps some much needed comic relief and celebration at this very difficult time? You can challenge your old working models. So there have been organizations that have done a huge drive to digital adoption. And actually, there's been evidence of real spikes in productivity because people have been working so intensely to deliver so much work in such a short period of time. And that does mean that processes have had to be simpler. And of course, remote working, if managed well, can be efficient, remove unnecessarily formal procedures, and add spontaneity, and also enable global connectivity in a way that you've not been able to leverage before. especially for those of you running global businesses. I've had many global executives tell me, they had their best ever category meetings, replacing days of global travel across the continents with, 1 or 2 or 1.5 days of Zoom. So those are just some of the innovations that we've seen in your particular sector. If I could have the next slide, please. Now, we've done at CMI some research. We were doing this pre-COVID, and I shared some of the findings about what are the skills that managers and leaders will need in the workforce is transformed by new technology. And obviously, since COVID struck, we actually reframed that experience to say, well, will how and where we work make a difference to how we lead and manage? And how can we help people, creating guides to best practice depending on how they're working at the moment. So if I could have the next slide, please. So what we did, and this is a complicated chart, but it basically segments the workplace. So at the top along the y-axis, you have remote working. And then at the bottom of that, you have 100% workplace or working, so where you're still on site. And then in the middle, you have blended working. And then on the x-axis, we have industries that have had, unfortunately, because the government has shut them, or they've not been able to carry on, where they've seen dramatic drop-offs in demand, something like SSP, an 80+% drop in demand, Heathrow Airport, an 80+% drop in flights, hospitality, but equally, and many of you are in that quadrant, we've had sectors and businesses where demand is rapidly increasing. So the food, obviously food supply, especially if you're in the baking, basics of essentials, and also hygiene products, and many other sectors where demand has really been booming, as well as in things like the NHS and demand for healthcare. So we've sort of segmented the workplace according to how and where you are working. And we've asked about, I think it's over 2,000 managers and leaders to try and find out what are the different stresses and strains. Now, this research is still coming back from the field, but we have some early sight of some learnings that I thought I would share with you. And that's on the next slide, please. So interestingly, and you're a little bit different here, but many of you said you were working remotely, and there were more working 100% remotely than were working on site. And that is very true with what we found. I think 67% of you said that you were working from home, and 26% of you said you were working blendedly. Now, the interesting thing for me is in our survey, as many people were working remotely as were working on site. But what you've said is actually less of you are working 100% in the workplace, only 7%. And now that may be something that's reversed as the COVID has increased again. But it seems that like our survey, a lot of you are doing more remote working. The overall agreement from everybody in the survey, no matter where they're working, is that there's been a negative impact for employee well-being, and there are real implications for that in terms of how we lead and manage. In terms of job security, and obviously job security is higher in some sectors than in others. Overall, in our survey, most managers and employees felt their job security was about the same. But about 1/3 thought, gee, I am working more hours here. And about 40% think that they're working more intensely since the pandemic. Now, the strain that puts on mental health, and we'll come back to that, is significant. Now, obviously, for those of you on this call where you're having less demand, and in our survey there were also, I think, the exact same number of organizations, 11%, experiencing less demand, you are in a super stressful situation. Not only do you have the challenge all the challenges of your colleagues, but you have the added challenge of organizational survival and the resilience of your employees in these sectors, many of whom, of course, are at risk of redundancy. No matter where or how you are working, there are some common challenges that you all face, and we're going to come on to these. And these are really around communication, employee engagement, and the very important aspect of boosting morale, boosting the company culture as we head into a time of COVID fatigue, quite frankly, because this isn't going away anytime soon. So if I could have the next slide, please. So what are the trends that you can leverage to try and deal with some of these challenges? I think there are 4 key trends that impact you and impact this audience, no matter where or how you are working. And if you leverage these well in your own management and leadership style and those of your teams, you, I think, can do a better job of coming out the other side of COVID with improvements in your overall management and leadership approach. And these 4 trends to leverage are the speed of digital transformation, the fact that done well, flexible working can be more human. If you leverage the opportunity to be more human in this crisis, you can build a more inclusive culture. And for many teams and leaders, it has been an opportunity to demonstrate more collaborative and agile leadership. So let's take a look at each of these in turn. If I could have the next slide, please. So the speed of digital transformation, there's a quote. This was a partner in a global law firm, and she told me, we've delivered our 2030 strategy in 1 weekend. You know, I had the CEO of IIP telling me most firms have condensed 10 months of innovation into 10 days. I'm sure you're no different. The speed of digital adoption has been absolutely enormous. COVID has been the great accelerator. And because of that, the so-called skeptics, and many of these are the most senior leaders, the CEOs, the chairs, who have said, it's absolutely impossible to fill in the blank, run a FTSE company, chair a board meeting, print a national newspaper, 100% remotely, have seen, my goodness, we can do that remotely. How amazing is that? And that has created a moment of reckoning for many of these senior leaders to say, wow, we really can embrace this trend. And actually, one of the knock-on effects of that reckoning is trust in your employees has played a much bigger role, because the skeptics that used to conflate working from home with skiving from home have seen that that is absolutely not true. And that has big impacts if we harness that. If I could have the next slide, please. So we know that done well, working from home and remote working is more human. And our research has shown that. There are many reasons for that. Everyone's in the same size box. So everybody here is, you know, in the same size box. Your cameras are off, but if they were on, we'd all be the same size. That's a great leveler. And also, it means you can involve more voices. The CMO of one food company told me, you know, it used to be we could only have the top team in the room, and when it was a physical meeting room. When it's remote, we can have subject matter experts on standby joining for part of the meeting. It makes for more voices. And these things have chat functions. So if you're not comfortable interrupting at a meeting, interrupting your boss in a meeting room or using that body language, you can stick your question on chat, which is what you're going to do here, and it'll get addressed. We've seen much more about our colleagues' lives than ever before. So we see their kids, we see their pets, we see inside their homes. There are much fewer barriers, you know, cats walking across computers and children crying and dogs barking. You know, another vice chair of the NHS I was interviewing, in the middle of the interview, he said, oh, rookie mistake, forgot to charge my computer. I'll just go upstairs and get a charger. You know, it's a very humanizing environment, and you're not wearing your office armor, right? The old suit and tie, and or the bright red workplace dress. We're all a lot more casual. And when we are more human like this, we are more productive. We did a survey with Mark Price's firm, Engaging Works, and actually we found that job satisfaction was higher. Most people felt they were more productive and actually more motivated. And actually 91% said that working for an organization that would offer them the opportunity on a permanent basis to work from home as well as in the office would motivate them to do their role well. So I think that's hugely important for employers to take note of in terms of how we organize our work in the future. If I could have the next slide, please. Now, that's that stat where 90% said it's really important to them that employers offer them a choice. And actually, a very large survey done by University of Birmingham and University of Kent found the same as RCMI University, and I think they had a base size of over 6,000, that people do enjoy working from home, and they would like to keep doing so after lockdown in some form. But when you start to bring people back to the office, and I know that was started and now it's stopped, but obviously it's always been the case in factories, but when you do bring people back, you really have to be careful about how you bring them back. You have to be very mindful, those of you that are managing a mixed workforce, of how you do that. And the first thing is you're going to have people that will not feel comfortable coming back. Maybe they don't want to use public transport. Maybe they have vulnerable households. It's very important that you listen to your employees and you find out individual circumstances and don't just order everybody back into the office or else ... And also, you have to be very mindful that you don't recreate what I'll call the club office culture. That's where all the senior managers go back into the office because they feel they need to set an example, but suddenly the rest of the workforce is there thinking, this is the old them and us. They are in the office around that hopefully socially distanced board table taking all the decisions, and we're all at home. And this has an added element of being very likely to exclude people. Most notably, most of those senior leaders in many industries are still white and male. And if you are female, if you are somebody that comes from a less well-represented group, you may be less likely to be around that table, and that may recreate actually even more the impression that it's a groupthink club taking all the decisions. So you have to make a really conscious decision, and this is a quote from a CEO at the NHS, not to resume factory settings. So, don't go back to the way it was, make it better. And actually that means, though, that you also have to manage the challenges of flexible working. And most of those challenges are around blurred lines between work and home and people saying they're working longer hours. So that's a really important thing to manage. Let people take breaks, let them go for walks, let them walk their dogs, let them play with their kids. It's so important that you allow people time to take breaks and fit their work around their lives, and make that accepted practice to be able to do that. If I could have the next slide, please. So I said we have an opportunity to build a more inclusive culture. So why is that, and how do we do that? The one chairman told me, you're familiar with the stakeholder wheel, and it isn't just him. Many, many leaders also in your industry have told me employees just go right to the center of the stakeholder wheel. They go right to the top of the priorities in a way that people claimed that our people come first, but actually didn't behave in that way. Well, now they really do come first. And they are just the essential focus for so many employers because they know they have to look after their health and well-being, or they face the inability to function during the crisis. That means that mental health in particular, has become incredibly central to workplace culture. So one insurance company chair told me he started giving well-being days. So everybody gets 3 full extra days of just for mental health and well-being. And the only requirement is that they go nowhere near a phone or a computer. We also know that for managers, this means, so managing inclusively means more communication, more listening to employees, and more consultation. So, lots of employers have done surveys. How would you like to work? How would you like to come back to work? What can we do to look after your well-being? What kind of Pilates classes or informal events would you like to do? What kind of activities can we do together, whether that's quizzes or just downtime talking or check-ins where, for example, it's a very good idea that you all check in once a day with various team members and just say, how are you? And then listen to their answer. And that is a lot of that, more of that is going on. Now, when it comes to inclusiveness, you do well, reasonably well on the gender pay gap, but there are still opportunities, and there are opportunities in every single business to make progress in terms of the diversity of leadership. And targets do help. Cranfield just released a report on do targets work? And guess what? Not surprisingly, they do, because if you want to increase your diversity, it's like any other business initiative. It's like a SKU simplification drive or a cost-cutting drive or a growth drive. You have to set a target to achieve the desired result. And you do have, by practicing these management behaviors and the flexible working, an opportunity here. And we know from the research we do that it's becoming increasingly well understood that greater diversity supports organizational resilience, it supports innovation, and it enables better decision making. And there's so much data available on that, and that's gender diversity, it's ethnic diversity, and it's also cognitive diversity. So it's a really important time to be inclusive. If I could have the next slide, please. The final point is collaborative agile leadership. And this is across the board, and I hope you've experienced this in your business. I'm sure you have. So suddenly, there's greater delegation to get on with things. It's about setting clear principles and setting a clear objective, and then delegating people to deliver it, because you just can't meddle at every moment. And we are becoming more outcome focused. So it's about what are the results, what are the key priorities. And that has also meant that we've had to break down some of our traditional silos. It's about teams and capabilities rather than org charts and departments, which it can be if you're, all sat in the office. Oh, we have a meeting, we need one from this department, that department. You don't need to do that anymore. You can actually just get capabilities together and form virtual project teams to get things done. And you don't have time to endless revisit. It's a very much a do, don't stew mentality, which for many people is a much more refreshing way of taking decisions. And let's face it, across the board, new heroes have emerged during this crisis. I'm sure you all have team members that have surprised you. And one of the things that leaders have said most to me, and I would say it of my own organization, is that they are surprised and delighted by how much their teams have delivered and what they've accomplished during this crisis. And it's very important that you celebrate the success and that you recognize the contribution of your team. It's very important that we have some positivity alongside all of this crisis. And we've done lots of things. We had our CMI Awards last night where we celebrated our award winners. We've given special awards of recognition to public sector workers. I know that companies have had many internal recognition programs to recognize their staff. It's just so important that we do that at this time. Now, the benefit of all of this agility is going to exist well beyond COVID. You're going to have greater growth, greater profitability, greater customer satisfaction and employee engagement. So that's something that you should really aim to keep up post-COVID. If I could have the next slide, please. So in summary, you do have a clear sector opportunity. Many of you are experiencing growing demand. You've had to move swiftly to simplify your processes. You've had to move swiftly to working remotely or blended. And if you can, carry on these emerging COVID culture trends well into the future, which are digital transformation, the ability to work both flexibly and humanly, listening to your employees and looking after their mental health and well-being, creating inclusive employee cultures, and making sure that you are creating diverse teams in every respect and keeping that collaborative, agile leadership. If you can do those things, then you will emerge from this crisis a better managed and led organization, attracting better talent, having a better culture, and achieving better results. Thank you, and I'd be delighted to take questions.
Thank you, Anne. That was really interesting. And it's great to see your enthusiasm and your energy about what is such a difficult time for so many people. You clearly recognise that there are opportunities to be grasped as well. If anyone has any questions, please do write them in the question pane. And whilst they're coming through, Anne, a question to start off with. Given the opportunities that have been created around COVID, how do you go about making them stick within your organisation and resisting the temptation to go back to the factory settings as people who are not necessarily in the senior leadership teams, but maybe sitting below those levels? What can people do to try and really harness the benefits of this way of working?
So I think that there are several things you can do. I think what we found is leaders are listening more, and they're listening more to people throughout the organization. So they're hosting more town halls. They're hosting more coffee chats. You know, and the CEO is doing more drop-ins and those sorts of things. So I think it's really important that when your leaders talk with you and ask you what you think, that you ask exactly the question that Fiona said. You know, say, so for example, when I was interviewing the vice chair of the NHS, there were a lot of NHS people on that call. And one of them asked him as a question, my team of consultants, we are collaborating more than we ever have before. We're really working together in this crisis, and it's so much more rewarding. What can you do to guarantee that when we come out of here, my manager doesn't come back and tell me to stop doing that? And he just said, well, don't do it, right? So if you're asked to go back to the way that you were working, don't. And I think it's really incumbent upon everybody to communicate to their senior leaders and managers how you like to work, the successes that you're having, of course, the problems that you're having as well. But I bet many of you have really good stories of success, and your leaders need to know that, and they need to know that you want to keep the principles alive that you've enabled in working well with each other during this crisis. And if your leader doesn't do those check-ins, shame on them. They should be doing those check-ins. Ask, you know, send a collective chat saying, you know, we would like to have a town hall with you. Can we arrange a time? Because you'll find that your senior leaders will be more attuned and will want to make themselves available. So those would be some of my tips.
Fantastic, thank you. I've got a question that's come in here, and it says, in companies where working from home has remained the norm since March, how do you avoid a fatigue behind a lack of social and physical interaction?
Yeah, it's a super, super good question. It's that COVID fatigue question. So there are a couple of things you can do. And you know, I think you have to be, again, quite agile and flexible. So you can arrange, you know, you're allowed to meet up to 6 at the moment. So you can arrange for teams to either book desks in your office or go to some sort of park or cafe where they can meet up in person. And I encourage that. So even if you're not, if the guidance is still work from home wherever you can have people go in and do check-ins, and do it within the rules. And I would encourage that, because people do need those interactions. And we've done that across the whole summer, and we're doing it into the fall. We have desks that you can book to check in. And if you have a bad situation at home and just need to escape because of whatever reason, you can do that as well. So that's one thing you can do. I think the other thing that is really important, is that you just acknowledge the situation and just say, I know how tough this is, and it's not ending anytime soon. Then that's what was done with the insurance exec that instituted the well-being days. That's what they did in response. They just said, we all know that you're going to need time off to collect your thoughts. So that's something you can do. And then the third thing that you can do is encourage everybody to take their holidays. So don't go with the government guidance that says, you can have them for up to 2 years. Make sure that you encourage your folks to take holidays and take breaks from work. And then lastly, on that daily basis, when I said give people the flexibility, do not expect your people to be at their laptops all day long. Somebody told me that somebody in an IT firm, they had software installed that counted the number of keystrokes on the laptop. That's barmy. I mean, that is the opposite of a trust culture. And of course, what it meant was people would have cups of coffee and just repeatedly press the space bar, right? Because, they cannot, but so create a trust culture where you give people the right to put in their diary that they're walking the dog or taking their kid to school or picking their kid up from school, and make sure that you encourage your people to take frequent well-being breaks during the day.
Brilliant, thank you. You've alluded to it a bit already, but is there anything else that you can share to help people ensure that we're meeting the needs of colleagues from a changing mental health perspective?
Well, you should train mental health first aiders. It's a really important thing to have. I know you all have fire marshals and, health and safety first aiders, people trained in CPR. Well, you need actually the equivalent for mental health. So these are special staff that, typically they do volunteer, just like for some of the other positions, and they undergo a special training course. And CMI, we work with mental health first aid. We have information on these things, and it's available. We have lots of free resources which I can send that give tips on managing mental health. But that's one. The other is when you're managing your team, you want to be looking for changes over time in how people appear. So if you have a team member and every time you meet, their camera's always off, that could be a sign that they're maybe withdrawing. In that situation, maybe what you want to do is get in touch with that person, and just ask, what are you doing to look after yourself? And just listen to their answer. And it's just very important that you give people the opportunity to talk about how they are feeling. And as a line manager, that is part of your job in this crisis. And it's also equally as important to look after yourself, right? So you can't look after your team if you don't look after yourself. And we know that managers, more than non-managers, will miss the workplace environment. So whether it's phoning a friend, whether it's phoning a good colleague, and remember, it doesn't all have to be on Zoom. Your phone still works. You can still just have a phone call, right? And walk. That's what I do, right? I walk. I go out on a walk. I take my phone and I call somebody and I ask how they're doing, and have a chat with them. So, that's a really important thing to be doing as well. But watching for those changes and intervening when you see a change and asking the person, hi, how are you? What are you doing to look after yourself? Is just one of the best things you can do.
Thank you, Anne. That's really good advice. I'm conscious of our time and I need to wrap up now. Is there any other bit of advice that you wanted to share with line managers at the moment? moments?
So I would encourage you, and I kind of have made this the theme of my presentation, is I know this is a really difficult time. I know your folks are getting tired. I would really encourage you to take time out to celebrate people, to thank them, to recognize them. You know, we are doing weekly shout outs. I'm doing weekly shout outs. It is so important that we keep up positivity, because you know the human spirit needs to feel positivity. We need to feel recognition, and the more you can instill that culture even in these hard times, and I'm not saying that you make it up, but you won't have to, because you will find so many examples of where people have stepped up. Make sure that you celebrate those times as well.